Hello and welcome to this special edition of Taiwan Talks live from the TaiwanPlus studio here in Taipei. I'm Ian Kavat.
And I'm Albert Chiu. We are bringing you analysis of the Taiwan presidential TV debate, where we heard the policy positions of Lai Ching-te of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, Hou You-yi of the main opposition party, the Kuomintang, KMT, and Ko Wen-je of the Taiwan People's Party, TPP.
Which of these candidates will best fill the shoes of outgoing President Tsai Ing-wen, who steps down after 2 terms in May 2024?
And how will the next president shape Taiwan's relations with China and the U.S., and what will that mean for the future of Taiwan Strait and the region?
Joining us to discuss the presidential debate are Courtney Donovan Smith, ICRT Radio Central Taiwan correspondent and former AmCham Taichung chair and Taiwan News columnist, and Yen Chen-shen, National Chengchi University Professor of Political Science.
A very warm welcome to both on the show.
In today's presidential debate, the spotlight was on cross-strait policies, with all 3 candidates showing openness to dialogue with China. Lai Ching-te of the DPP emphasized his presidency would carry the least risk, aiming to preserve the current situation.
Hou You-yi said his stance rejected both Taiwanese independence and the one country, two systems framework. Meanwhile, Ko Wen-je said he would serve as a mediator in U.S. China relations.
Professor Yen Chen-shen, let me come to you first. So was there anything in today's debate that was unexpected, that was new? What were the defining moments?
Well, I thought, I have observed so many American presidential debates. So I thought this one, at least, we should bring up the issue of how each candidate offers so many we call, programs, benefits to the youth, and increase the budget for the long-term care and for defense, education, everything. Where do you get the money? I think in America, a lot of times when a candidate proposes new programs, they will say, we're going to raise certain tax, or we will cut certain area. I never heard of anyone cutting anything, but just keep pouring money. So I thought the questioners will at least raise some issue about the fiscal responsibility here, but didn't hear anything.
So you believe that the candidates were not held accountable for these promises?
Well, Ko Wen-je did mention that he tried to balance the budget. As a mayor, he saved a lot of money, but he never mentioned about how, as a presidential candidate, that what he would do.
Donovan, so with the candidates, did anybody perform particularly well or particularly bad for you?
Well, this is what I found interesting. I was looking at the performances of all 3, and basically what I think people are going to take away is that whoever they already support, they're going to think won it. I didn't feel like there was a standout candidate who did spectacularly well over the others. I thought all of them put in a pretty solid performance. And I think that this will be good for shoring up the base of each one. But I don't see that people are going to go, yeah, that candidate did better, even though I might not vote for him. I don't think that it's changed anybody's minds.
So it's not going to move the needle for you in terms of the election, influencing swing voters or undecided voters? What
I think it mostly will do is, I think it will solidify the bases that they already have. Now, as far as swing voters, that's such a diverse group of people. What they're going to take away from each of the candidates is kind of hard to predict, because they are so diverse and they're not at all homogenous. So I think all 3 of the candidates have a good shot at winning over some new voters, but it could be any of the 3.
Okay, so regarding the China policy, so do 2 of you think that the 3 candidates actually reflect a significant alignment among themselves? Because we know that William Lai, even himself, expressed the friendliness, if you will, with the possibility to talk to President Xi. Or are there any notable distinctions in their approaches? Maybe Professor Yen.
Well, I think all 3 candidates talk about maintaining the status quo, right? But in order to achieve status quo, either you negotiate with the Beijing or you don't, right? You don't, then Beijing will look at Taiwan saying, if you continue to refuse, then you are pursuing an independence road. But if we claim that we want just status quo only, then Beijing think, you're just following the U.S. and not, maintaining, ruling out the possibility of unification, then they will not accept. So it is a difficult one. How do you maintain status quo? I think the three candidates never offer us a strategy of successful confirmation that they will be able to achieve this. Right. This is what everybody wants, but what is the process that you're going to achieve status quo? I think this is where in Taiwan we need to find out. Even if we, like in 1992 consensus, even if we pretend to formally acknowledge one China, just like U.S. acknowledge there's, it's one China policy, but you don't have to follow it. But by admitting there's only one China there, that at least you can negotiate for status quo. But if you reject that, then I think there is no possibility there.
Right, because from the CCP's perspective, the so-called status quo is the least option that President Xi will want. What about you, Donovan?
Well, what's interesting is there's a narrative out there that there's been a lot of convergence among the parties, and that they're all the same now, basically. I disagree with that strongly. But if you do say compare it to the early 1990s, then yes, they do sound much more similar than they did back then, of course. But however, I think there are still very significant differences between the three parties and their stances. Now, obviously, William Lai wants to continue with the path that Tsai Ing-wen has forged, and he's very explicitly said that's exactly what he plans to do. So that would be probably more of the same. However, if he becomes the president, any change to the current status quo, which is different than it was in years past, that would come from the Chinese side. Now, you've got Hou Yu-ih, of course, and he's supporting the 1992 consensus, which is deeply unpopular with the electorate. Now, he's trying to sort of play some word games with this. He's saying that he opposes one country, two systems, and will not accept that. The problem he has there is that Xi Jinping, on January 2nd in 2019, tied one country, two systems to the 1992 consensus. So, depending on how that's interpreted, he's basically either not accepting the 1992 consensus, or, so the question there is, would the Chinese side accept that? He also says that he wants to follow the Constitution, which defines, of course, that means that there can be no unification because the Republic of China is the Constitution, and so therefore it can't. There's no unification.
Right. Professor Yen, I actually have a follow-up quick for you. Is that do you have any suggestion to KMT regarding Xi Jinping's link between 92 consensus and one country, two system?
Well, I think first of all, KMT should insist that this is a term that coined by Taiwan by the KMT, right? So it is China first rejected, and later they embrace it. So it's not like Taiwan is embracing something offered by China. This is something Taiwan offered first, and then KMT first reject it, and then come back and say, this is not bad, maybe we should embrace it. So I think this is the one people have misunderstood this particular term. Yes, a lot of people felt this is too old, but think of this. In Taiwan, if we want to insist on certain principle, we cannot have things just keep changing. Look at the U.S., look at Israel, look at China. They offer a policy position. They stick with for decades. And we, even though we are a democracy, political party come and change. But still, there are certain things that we should adhere to so that we can negotiate with the other side. If we don't want to negotiate, fine. But then cut off all the trade relation with China. That's my offer, saying, we have nothing to do with Beijing. We have nothing to do with mainland. So cutting off the tourists, cutting off all kinds of trade. From days on, we're going to embrace Southeast Asia, European markets, Northeast Asia, or United States.
Professor, could you define the 1992 consensus?
Well, 1992 consensus is like both sides acknowledge there's only one China, but you can have different interpretation. And it is because of this acknowledgement of one China, just like every country in the world saying there is only one China. They have different China policy, so you can have different interpretation. So what I'm trying to say is, if we set different interpretation, we are actually in line with the U.S., with Japan, with European Union, because every time they said they care about the security of Taiwan Strait, but they also said our one China policy does not change.
Let me bring Donovan in. So actually on Taiwan Talks this week, political scientist Ian Jia-chong says that for Taiwan there is a danger in agreeing to the 1992 consensus because, in order to have dialogue with China, because Beijing has never actually acknowledged the second part of the of 1992 consensus, which is that there are different interpretations for what is one China, and that at any time, Beijing, if Taiwan agreed, Beijing could hold Taiwan to account and say that there is only one China and the PRC is a sole government.
I mean, there needs to be two or three distinctions made here. So yes, the KMT's interpretation is that there is one China, so they accept the one China principle, but then they tacked on both sides with their own interpretation. The PRC's version of the 1992 consensus is there is one China, and they've linked it to one country, two systems. So they're really kind of talking at cross purposes, but they both agree on the one China principle. Now, the U.S. one China policy acknowledges that China thinks that Taiwan is part of China, but that's a little bit like saying, oh, I have a nice tie, don't I? I acknowledge you think you have a nice tie. It's not the same as actually agreeing with it. So there's a big difference between the one China policy and the one China principle. And a lot of other countries have similar wording to the United States. So now you asked about the risks. The problem is, yes, as soon as you accept the 1992 consensus, or more fundamentally than that, the one China principle, then that does compromise to a certain degree Taiwan's sovereignty. And that helps back Taiwan into something of a corner, which is the primary objection that William Lai has to it, and the DPP. Ko Wen-je's primary problem with the 1992 consensus is quite different. It's because it's unpopular in Taiwan, not because he's not willing to accept it, which is an interesting distinction.
And so renaming it, what does that achieve? Which is something that he's called for.
That's what he's hoping will happen. The problem is that China won't accept anything other than accepting the one China principle as a basis for talks. There's just no way they will accept anything else.
Professor.
But I do think, when Taiwan and China, we talk about one China, but I don't think KMT purposely mentioned one China principle. So that's why I'm saying, if the U.S. one China policy at different places, it's all we call one China, different interpretation. So if you look at also saying, the both sides.
But does Beijing accept that?
Well, Beijing will not accept, but they will not deny saying, KMT is wrong not to say one China principle. It's just like the U.S. and China right now. After Xi and Biden's meeting, or all kinds of meetings, you look at the readout, both are different, right? But they never say, oh, I didn't say that, or we didn't have that. So in a way, they have different interpretation of a summit meeting. But there is also mutual non-denial of the others saying.
Well, I think the ambiguity was intentionally made back to when. But anyway, let's come back to the public opinion in Taiwan. Ko Wen-je of the TPP actually highlighted the opinion polls. He said that in the debate that 90% of the Taiwanese people favor keeping the status quo regarding the cross-strait relations. Consequently, the stance of preserving the status quo has become a very key strategy both him and Lai Ching-te in managing cross-strait affairs. So these developments actually prompts an analysis of Lai Ching-te's evolving viewpoints, something new we seemingly see in this debate. How does Lai Ching-te shift from previously aligned with the Taiwanese independence? Maybe he himself is not openly saying that out loud now because this is during a campaign, but he's regarded in that stance. Now kind of shift to a willingness to engage with the China, affect his political strategy and approach to the cross-strait relations.
Yeah, I noticed that Ko highlighted the numbers. Probably are coming from the NCCU polls. So Ko Wen-je's stance has definitely shifted. I mean, he's shifting, but he doesn't seem to be knowing quite where he's going with this. And so when the candidates all talk about the status quo, there's a little bit of a problem with talking about the status quo because nobody's really defining it very well. And I think all the three candidates have a slightly different view of what that means. Because the status quo that existed, say, in the 1990s or the 1980s, it was very different in the 1980s than it was in the 90s. And of course, particularly since when Nancy Pelosi visited, the status quo has changed again. And each time, it's the Chinese side that's changing it. So I think the difference between the three candidates when they talk about the status quo, I think each of the three candidates has a slightly different meaning. I think William Lai is talking about it as it is now, whereas I think Hou Yu-ih wants to turn back the clock to the Ma era, which he views as the status quo when relations were considerably warmer between Taiwan and China. And Ko, I don't really know how he defines the status quo, because as far as I know, I've never heard him actually come out and give us a clear idea of what he means by that.
Oh, I think the status quo eventually will be defined by the U.S. because the U.S. is the one that decides if there is a military conflict across the Taiwan Strait, that which side unilaterally changed the status quo. So if China changed the status quo, but we think China changed, U.S. doesn't think China changed, and then attack Taiwan, U.S. said, no, China didn't change the status quo, so I'm not going to come to your assistance. So if China thinks Taiwan changed the status quo and attacked Taiwan, but U.S. said, no, Taiwan didn't change the status quo, then U.S. has strong justification to send military force to help Taiwan. So eventually, I think it would depend on the U.S. and China relation. So when we try to define our status quo, I think at the end, it's all decided by Washington, D.C.
Would you help us to understand that whether Lai Ching-te's kind of shifting stance like this is going to help him in a campaign?
My observation is always this, U.S. probably trusts Hou Yu-ih more than, venture out of, the different policy, came out with a different policy. Ko Wen-je is very unpredictable, but Lai, himself right now embrace Tsai Ing-wen's policy, but I think there is still some reservation because he called himself a Taiwan independence worker.
All right, thank you. So now let's have a break, and then we can continue the discussion after advertisement.
You're watching a special edition of Taiwan Talks, and we're bringing you analysis of the presidential election debate. So let's go to a short break.
Taiwan votes for a future after President Tsai.
A new leader to manage ties with Washington and Beijing.
And find balance in a volatile region. In an election that could reshape our world.
TaiwanPlus, your guide in uncertain times.
Bringing you analysis from Taiwan and abroad.
Immediate reactions as the results roll in.
And a deep dive into Taiwan's future.
Join us on election night for our live specials. Taiwan Talks, Taiwan Votes, and Taiwan Connects. Only on TaiwanPlus.
As Taiwan votes for its next president, the stakes are high.
It's an election about Taiwan's future, which could impact the world.
How do Taiwan's peace and integrity matter to Asia, the United States, and beyond?
Join us for in-depth analysis from Taiwan and around the world.
Join us on Taiwan Talks for the election special, only on TaiwanPlus.
Taiwan is voting for a future after President Tsai Ing-wen.
TaiwanPlus has reporters on the ground.
We'll bring you a reaction as the results roll in.
The whole world is watching. We've got you covered.
Join us on election night for our live special, Taiwan Votes, only on TaiwanPlus.
Welcome back to Taiwan Talks as we discuss the Taiwan presidential TV debate between Lai Ching-te of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, Hou Yu-ih of the main opposition party, the Kuomintang, KMT, and Ko Wen-je of the Taiwan People's Party. Let me come to Donovan first. So this week it was the 130th anniversary of Mao Zedong's death, and at that event, Xi Jinping once again stressed that unification with Taiwan is inevitable. And of course, he said the same thing to Joe Biden last month. And he plans to do this peacefully or by force. Do you think that this was adequately taken on board, incorporated into the candidates' China policies during this debate?
I don't think that it had that much of an impact. And the reason I say that is because this kind of language is not new. So you look at a lot of, say, the Western media, and they gave this a lot of play. And the reason they did that is because they haven't heard this kind of talk for so long.
But the timing during election campaign.
Yes. Well, obviously it's part of China's pressure campaign. And you'll notice that in this debate, the whole issue of China and issues related to China dominated. It was, I think as a percentage, my guess is it was roughly about 70% was in some form or another related to China or their homes and properties. So I do think that these comments by Xi possibly influenced the reporters' questions, which were heavily related to the China issue. I also noticed that the candidates, even when they were asked questions on other topics, did at various times pivot back to China-related topics. So, I don't know if there's a one-to-one correlation, but I did get the sense that it may have helped influence the amount of debate. It just is part of that general atmosphere. Not necessarily specific that comment, but that comment contributes to this general tense atmosphere. And so I think that was really felt in the debate.
Professor Yen, can there be mutual respect between Taiwan and China? If China wants to take Taiwan, Taiwan doesn't want that to happen?
Well, I think, I have offered before, I have talked about this, is that if Taiwan proposed that we want unification, but by our terms, which China would never agree, but China can never accuse Taiwan, pursuing independence. We can argue we want independence, we want freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition. China said crazy, but we said, but we want unification. So this is my answer to having a plan for maintaining status quo, because China can never agree with our offer, so we maintain status quo. That's my argument. But for people in Taiwan right now, DPP talk about wanting to talk to China, but not under the 1992 consensus. If you are capable, if you think you can convince Beijing side, why don't you just first start to talk using 92 consensus and arguing we don't agree with this consensus, and I am going to come up with a new consensus that we can engage in the future. But I think the DPP is avoiding China because this is politically expedient and also basically good for its election strategy. Ko Wen-je, I think, eventually will be more innovative on this one, coming up with something.
Okay, let's bring back the role of the United States. Okay, but probably we'll enter the break really soon. But just kind of let me finish up the question, and maybe you can answer the question after break. In addressing the complexities of U.S. China-Taiwan relations, Ko Wen-je actually emphasized that Taiwan should not act as a pawn in the U.S.-China interactions, but instead serve as a bridge. He specifically mentioned that. So based on the discourse in today's debate, featuring the three candidates, what diplomatic challenges might incoming president expect to face? Maybe Donovan.
Okay, so the incoming president, the three candidates, I think that Ko's talk aligns more with Ho's. Both of them have talked about, Ho has talked about being in the middle between the two and having equal relations with both, not siding to one or the other. Ho has said that's the ideal, but under current circumstance need to align closer to the U.S.
Professor Yen.
Oh, well, I think, Ho is more in the line of U.S. policy, but Ko is less predictable. But Ko also offers something that is really strange, because he talked about Taiwan doesn't need any diplomatic ally. I think this is a very different one. Does that mean China can easily take our diplomatic ally, or there's no, we call, diplomatic truce at all?
Okay, we've just heard all three candidates set out their policy positions on China, foreign relations, defense, and the economy. Now it's up to you to decide which presidential candidate is most